Hello, I'm Ailie Kofoid, CEO of EML Americas, here to talk to you about the future of cashless disbursements. We've seen significant shifts in the payments landscape over the last 18 to 24 months, largely due to COVID. And we can break the consumer shift into two segments. First, let's talk about how we as consumers are making payments. We've seen a significant shift in contactless payments in the US, a region historically lacking in the adoption of retailers accepting tap and mobile payments. According to analyst firm eMarketer, in-store mobile payments usage grew 29% in 2020 in the US. Last year, 92.3 million US consumers aged 14 or older used digital mobile payments at least one time in a 6-month period. Now, the US has grown to be the second largest market with $465 billion worth of mobile transactions, second only to China. In 2020, the National Retail Federation published a survey finding that 67% of US retailers now accepted contactless payments. It's been a big shift in the US. In Canada, we're seeing a similar shift. Compared to pre-COVID use, 57% of Canadians reported using cash less, and 32% using checks less. Consumers in North America are moving away from cash and checks as a payment method. In Europe and the UK, an increase to the contactless transaction limit, how much you can tap for, has fueled further growth of contactless payments. In fact, Visa has indicated that over 80% of in-store Visa payments in Europe are now contactless. And no surprise to anybody sitting here, Australia is even further ahead in the digital consumer payments space. The CBA shared that between March 2020 and March 2021, right in the middle of COVID, the number of digital wallet transactions increased by 90%, and they believe that digital wallets will be the most popular contactless way to pay by the end of the year. So what is driving these crazy increases to contactless and digital consumer payments? Well, MasterCard did a 17,000-person global survey, and they're seeing trends that lead them to believe that cash is verging on extinction, with 82% of the people who took the survey saying that they believe contactless payment options are cleaner than cash in these COVID times. No surprise, probably. But contactless payments are up to 10 times faster than other in-person payment methods, and it enables people to get in and get out of the stores faster. So we all want to pay electronically. We want to pay with our phones. We want to tap and pay. We don't want to deal with cash, and heaven forbid we don't want to write checks. But guess what? We also want to receive payments from companies electronically. We want those disbursements quickly, safely, and easy to spend. A 2018 study by the IT Group indicated that in the US alone, companies make more than 3.5 billion payments to consumers annually, worth $10.7 trillion. It's a lot of payments. That's everything from insurance claims, rewards, rebates, and payments from businesses to their workers. And yet, at least in the US, paper checks are still leading the way. And if they're not sending paper checks, they're sending ACH, which is slow and cumbersome. Companies are not keeping up with how their customers want to get paid. And so to stay competitive in this changing payments landscape, organizations must modernize their disbursement methods. And that includes consumer choice. From reduced expenses related to the disbursements to more secure payment methods, to a new way to engage with their consumers and to drive brand recognition, consumer choice payment platforms for disbursements are the new future. And that's where our partners like SafeRide, which provides payments for healthcare reimbursements, or AptPay, who provides a variety of solutions across gaming and insurance disbursements, are making such a shift in the payments industry. EML solutions like Seamless and NuaPay also come into play. These payments platforms reduce the cost for the company providing the disbursements, and it provides instant access to funds and a great user experience for the consumers. So let's dive a little bit deeper into one of these partnerships, AptPay. They're removing cash from previously cash-heavy environments like scrapyards and casinos across the US and Canada. They're looking at how insurance disbursements can be distributed more quickly. Driven by consumer choice, they're providing a robust white-labeled platform for organizations, including fully compliant consumer KYC and payment solutions which push funds to bank accounts via a debit card or on a prepaid card. Both payment options provide nearly instant payments to consumers in a secure method and eliminate the challenge and risks of managing cash in a high-volume environment. EML Seamless allows organizations to disperse funds to consumers or to SMEs through a multitude of payout options. So some interesting statistics to share with you, and I bet none of these are a surprise. 73% of consumers want and demand choice. 72% of us think speed is important when receiving our disbursements. 74% of us want funds immediately available and ready and safe to spend. 20% of us are willing to pay any fee to receive instant payment. And consumers who have trouble paying their bills, those underbanked consumers, tend to be the happiest with instant payments in a disbursement method that they can use. EML Seamless platform has a simple, powerful API or an intuitive, easy-to-use UX for companies to offer a variety of fast, secure, electronic payment options to their customers. But it isn't just corporate organizations who are listening to or who need to listen to their customers' desire to move to electronic payments. It's also government organizations. EML is partnering with MasterCard and the Northern Ireland government to distribute £273 million of COVID stimulus to the citizens of Northern Ireland through MasterCard prepaid cards. That's to stimulate them to go shopping on the high street. Each resident aged 18 and over is receiving a prepaid card worth £100. We'll hear more in the next session about this program and the benefits that the Northern Ireland government is seeing. And I can't wait to hear more about it from Nikki and Nabil. EML's delivered similar stimulus programs and relief programs globally, including with the government of Jersey in the United Kingdom and the United Way in the United States. COVID has fundamentally changed our lives in countless ways. We all know this. And technology continues to adapt to those changes. One significant change is how we as consumers want to pay for our goods and services and how we expect to receive payments from companies, whether insurance payments, refunds, rebates, or early access to our wages. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm pleased to introduce EML CEO of Europe, Nikki Evans, and from MasterCard, Nabil Irshad, for a continued discussion on the Northern Ireland program and on cashless disbursements.
Hello, Nabil, and thank you for joining us for this fireside chat about the public sector. Do you mind just telling me a little bit more about your role in MasterCard and what your focus is?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Nikki, and pleasure to be joining you. So really what I do at MasterCard, so my role is to look after our relationship and our business development with the government and public sector, both at a national level, but also at a local level, of which there are many programs that we work on. And really there are essentially sort of 3 or 4 areas that we spend a lot of our time working on with the government and public sector. So the first is really around kind of commercial card payments. So these are cards which the government uses for purchasing goods and services from suppliers. So these are typically commercial cards, procurement cards, and there's a variety of flavors of those used across particularly national government, but also at some local authorities and with other agencies that are linked to the public sector. So, for example, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office uses those cards across their embassies overseas and here in the UK as well. Then we do a lot of work with both, again, national government departments, but also particularly with local authorities with the use of prepaid cards. And obviously, this is where we've done a lot of work with yourselves at EML and working with government departments and agencies, where these cards are used to disperse funds from the government to the citizen. And these are typically cards that are used by people who are perhaps more vulnerable, or where the government is trying to inject money into the economy and doing that through a disbursement scheme where they're giving cards to citizens and then loading them with some funds. And then there are 2 other areas which may not be so relevant for this discussion, but it's worth just reflecting on them as part of the role that we do. One of which is we do a lot of work, and increasingly we have done over the last 18 to 20 months, where we've been working with governments in terms of providing flavors of our payments data, obviously very anonymized, but helping them to understand what the impact of COVID has been on the high streets or on a particular sector of the economy, over the last 18 to 20 months, and helping those decision makers and policy makers to really think about how to plan for a post-COVID recovery and where to focus their efforts and focus their resources and so forth. And then the last area, which it does link with particularly our work on the disbursement side that I mentioned earlier on, but we do a lot of work within the industry championing financial inclusion. There are still around 1 million people in the UK who do not have bank accounts. Roughly 50% of those, it's because of, it's a choice that they've made. But the other 50% is because they've not been able to access a bank account product. And that has a lot of ramifications in terms of, their financial well-being, their financial lives. So we spend a lot of our time as well within the industry advocating for better financial inclusion through improved products, improved services. And we also have a number of initiatives at MasterCard, both at the UK level, but also globally, where we've made, some fairly sizable commitments around around financial inclusion and bringing more and more people into the digital economy and including more people into the financial system, because there are lots of benefits both to businesses and to consumers and citizens in terms of bringing them into the financial system. So we do our bit in the UK to support that overall objective as well. So hopefully that's a whistle-stop tour of what we do.
It's interesting.
I was going to say it's one of those things where my job title is government and public sector, but in reality, as with lots of jobs, you end up doing something that's much wider and more expansive than what you're labelled as necessarily. But
if you don't mind me just touching briefly on, you mentioned there that one of the parts of your role is looking at the data and sort of advising government on policy. As a matter of interest, what trends are you seeing coming out as a result of COVID in how people make payments?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a few things to say on that. Probably the most obvious one, and I don't think it's unique to the UK, it's certainly the case kind of wider in Europe in terms of some of the data that we've seen, is that in 2020 in particular, which I guess was the first full year of COVID, there was a dramatic decline in payment volumes in the UK. So UK Finance, which is a sort of respected industry body here, published a report in June of this year, which had the sort of full year of 2020 data where they were looking at different forms of payments. And overall payments fell by about 11% to 36 billion in 2020. And that was due to the variety of lockdowns that we had here in the UK, various restrictions on what people could do, where people could go out. I mean, if you remember last year, there were, and this has been the case in many countries around the world, where whole sectors were essentially shut down. In the UK, for example, pretty much all nightlife was closed for periods of the year. Restaurants were closed, any kind of hospitality, etc. And obviously, because everyone was pretty much working from home, unless you were in a profession where you needed to be in the office, everyone was no longer spending as much money, for example, on the high street, whether it be at sandwich shops or in the pubs, having a drink after work, whatever it might be. And there were some other interesting things that kind of flowed through from that overall trend, and that is that now the majority of transactions in the UK are by card, and that was driven by a few things during the pandemic. One of which was because a number of merchants stopped accepting cash as a form of payments, and that was because of potential concerns around the spread of infection and risk of infection of COVID, and also because the government last year raised the contactless limit from what was originally £30 to £45, and actually more recently they've announced, and I think it was in October, that they've increased that further to £100 now. So last year, around a quarter or so of all payments were contactless. I expect that trend will, certainly accelerate now, particularly as they've raised the contactless limit further. So, I think the overall story was, payments declined during COVID, and also the types of payments that people were making also changed. So cards became the majority method of payment. Cash now makes up about 20% of all payments, which is a real decline over the last few years, and that's been happening for a long time. But obviously, COVID has accelerated that. And as I say, when you look at card payments as well, contactless has really gone, has really accelerated during the time. And then it just, because you asked about other, aspects of what it's telling us about the economy. I think just the other thing to maybe kind of pull out of some of the statistics that we've seen, and this is pretty obvious, but there has been a huge decline in the cross-border and international payments, mainly because people haven't really been traveling. Obviously, tourism has been really severely affected during the pandemic. We're starting to see that come back now this year. And certainly we've seen domestic spend, be much stronger this year, and actually exceeding some of the levels that we saw in 2019. So almost, not just back to where we were, but actually, growing as you would have expected us to grow in 2020 had things not been, affected by COVID. And you can see that as well, just when you go out and about in the towns, people are out and about a bit more, people are spending again. And I guess, one question mark, I guess, for 2022 will be is that how much of the savings that people have accrued over the last year and a half, those people who've been fortunate enough to have the ability to save money, how much of that spending will kind of roar back to life in 2022. There's a bit of a debate, particularly here in the UK, about that, whether people have now got the saving habit and are perhaps not going to spend as much, and so transactions and payments in the economy will sort of not be as resilient as perhaps initially thought, or whether actually there will be a far more, people will be much more attracted to go back out into the high street and spend a lot more. And that's partly, and I'm sure we'll get on to this later on, but that's partly why some authorities that we've been working with, particularly obviously in Northern Ireland, but also Jersey, where they have started to, where they have implemented schemes to actually encourage people to go out and spend by essentially providing helicopter money and governments pumping money into the economy direct to consumers, to try and encourage people to get out, to spend again, and to be comfortable with kind of, being out and about as normal as we used to be.
And I guess on that note, we've obviously provided both Northern Ireland and Jersey government with a solution to do that. One thing though that I noted, neither the governments went for a digital option, so where the card could be delivered directly to a mobile phone. They both went for a plastic option. I mean, what's your view on how quickly the public sector will embrace, I guess, some of the innovation that is there around how we can make payments?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the UK, certainly, I think there is actually a really, I think the government does in general appreciate and is keen to innovate in the payment space. And, if we look at Northern Ireland, for example, so yes, they went for a card solution rather than, say, a digital solution. But that was also wrapped up with other reasons. So first of all, they wanted to ensure that the solution was as inclusive as possible. And so they wanted to make sure that even if you didn't have a smartphone, for example, or even any phone whatsoever, you still had the ability to both apply for and use the card that they were offering, which would have £100 on it. But also, from a government's point of view, they wanted to make sure that, it was very visible. And they, if you have a phone, it's a bit less visible. Having your card, there's perhaps a little bit less excitement around it as well. There was something about receiving something in the post that lands in there, which is effectively £100, and being able to have that. The government wanted to be associated with that, wants to have some of the brand association with that, and so a card was a very good way in which that they could do that. And that was similar in Jersey, which obviously was a scheme that was the first really that did this. They call it a sort of direct-to-consumer scheme, which happened in September of 2020, which was extremely successful. And again, they had a very strong communications and marketing campaign around this card, which landed on everyone's doorstep. So I think that those sorts of factors come into it when governments think about how to disperse funds or how to look at payments. They, one of the big things that government thinks about is how do we make sure that we reach everyone and we're not being exclusive in terms of any particular solution that we're using to disperse funds, as it might be. But I think what Northern Ireland and Jersey have done is actually really demonstrated how you can effectively disperse funds quickly in a safe manner, in a way that is engaging for consumers and for citizens, that obviously has a level of brand awareness and brand value, but also really critically from the government's point of view, the data that they get from those sorts of schemes is really valuable in terms of understanding whether how the policy has, whether the policy has been successful, understanding what the trends were, and potentially also using that data in the future for, other schemes or other policy areas that they may want to pursue. And that was very much the case in Jersey, where the government actually really embraced that side of it. Actually published a public-facing report, an evaluation report, which really detailed how the scheme operated, where people spent their money, geographically, where they spent their money, not just also the different segments, what was the average transaction value that the customer was spending, how many of the funds were actually used, how much were not used. And it was a really valuable report, which then they used to be able to sort of go back to citizens almost and go back to their stakeholders and to kind of say, look, this is what we said that we would do, and here's the proof of the pudding. This is what we did. And it was extremely well received, and I know that they found it extremely valuable. So Northern Ireland, I think, is going to do the same. They've already made some interim statements about how the scheme has been running. There'll be more of those as the scheme comes to a close towards the end of the year. And I think that value is not lost on governments. And I think increasingly we're seeing where governments have perhaps used a more traditional paper-based voucher solution, they're now much more open to looking at prepaid cards, digital forms of payment as well, in order to get funds to citizens as safely, quickly, and efficiently as possible.
And the adaptation to the Northern Ireland scheme has been staggering. I just noted that we reached 1 million activations this morning, and when you look at the size of the population in the country, that's nearly 2/3 now have activated a card at this stage and are out spending it. And it's great to see what it's putting back into the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been hugely successful, and I think it speaks to the fact that EML, the Northern Ireland government, and ourselves, the collaboration involved in bringing that to the market has really paid dividends in terms of the uptake, and that's the thing I would say about some of these schemes is. One of the things that I remember when we had conversations with Jersey in the summer of 2020, they were very keen that this wasn't just going to be money that was given to citizens, and it would kind of almost replace day-to-day spending, because that doesn't really have the multiplier effect that the government wants. What they wanted to do, and what Northern Ireland also has wanted, is to kind of really position this as a way to sort of almost like a kind of treat money. It's something that something that you might, for example, not have been thinking about buying before, or maybe been reluctant to buy because it might be a bit expensive. But here's £100 that you can use against that potential purchase. So if you've been umming and ahhing about it for a while, maybe this is the thing to kind of get you over the line to purchase that. And I think that's brought a lot of excitement to it. And so I'm sure everyone likes the idea of receiving some free money from the government. And I think the fact that it's been hugely successful in Northern Ireland, the Gordon Lyons, who's the Minister of the Economy there, has been a huge advocate for it as well. He's been very visible in terms of advocating for the scheme, both in press and in terms of his parliamentary colleagues, etc. I think it's been a really fantastic scheme, and I know that we're having tentative conversations in other parts of the UK, for example, in Scotland, and with some English councils who are, who have been very, very interested in what Northern Ireland has been doing, and are thinking about, well, is this something that we might be able to do here at a more local level? Because, unfortunately, we are still living with COVID, and we are still living with, some of the effects of that in terms of, people's behaviours and, people's reluctance around going to high street, which is perfectly understandable. But hopefully, if we do try and move out of a COVID world into a post-COVID world where we want to try and encourage people to come back onto the high street, to be more comfortable, something like this might be a good way to sort of help encourage that shift back into what we might think of as normal life.
Exactly. And I guess a card is a good solution because of the spend controls that you can put around it in terms of locking it down to a country or a particular group of merchants. And so from a government's perspective, the ability to get the funds to where they need to go and to be spent in a way that the program is designed is probably a great advantage of using a card solution over just a payment into a bank. And I guess in terms of the challenges for governments and the payments that they need to make, where do you see the biggest challenges for governments across Europe?
Yeah, so I think for me, I think some of the challenges that government faces when it's thinking about payments overall, but I'll also speak specifically around dispersing funds to citizens. So I think there's a first thing, which is just actually more of a kind of education point of view. Almost, it's there's perhaps not always the kind of familiarity or understanding of how payments work, and there's some concerns around, are they secure, and how, what are the commercials around them, and those sorts of things. And I think we spend quite a bit of our time, supporting yourselves and other issuers, and also when we speak to governments around helping them to understand how, particularly card-based payments, but all forms of payments, whether it's electronic, digital payments, etc. The sort of benefits that they have over perhaps more traditional forms of payment like vouchers or cash, etc. The messages around security, around the sort of data which I mentioned before, the usability of them, and also particularly when we're thinking about some of those sort of social benefit programs. It's a really important point, but it's just the dignity around those payments, because we know that a lot of people who perhaps receive vouchers or kind of quite obvious things which mark them out as being a receipt of benefits can be quite embarrassing when they go into shops and having to display those to the at the checkout, where other people can see that they're using vouchers and they must be on benefits, and that can be quite personally embarrassing. So using cards or other electronic payment forms is a real way to, I guess, bring some more dignity into the whole process. And that's something which, we also talk to government about, helping them to understand how this is a more, financially inclusive. Again, we talk about financial inclusion. It's a much more inclusive way in which to do it. So there's, I think, the kind of perception bit around government. That's an ongoing challenge. And that's, it's not a criticism of government. I mean, they're not payments specialists or experts. That's partly why they talk to organizations like ourselves. But we see a lot of our role in terms of helping them to understand that. And then I think when it comes specifically to disbursements, I think the other challenges is, I mentioned it before, but it's governments often want to make a solution that is as inclusive as possible. And sometimes the perception is that electronic payments or digital payments are not inclusive, because if you don't have a phone, for example, or if you don't have a bank account or anything like that, it's felt like, well, how are those people going to be able to access it? And that's where, again, the education comes in, because, as you very well know, with a prepaid card, you don't need to have a bank account, for example. There's relatively limited KYC required. So there's a lot of ways in which you can reach those people who might not be reachable through other forms, because it's such a flexible solution. So again, it comes to that point around the education piece, which is a ongoing challenge, but it's a challenge that we kind of relish, because actually once they kind of see the benefits of it, then the light bulb goes off almost, and you kind of see them understanding like, this is a really great way to do it. And actually, just as one additional point, if I may, when Jersey were originally looking at a stimulus scheme in their economy, so this was back in the summer of 2020, they very publicly said that they were also considering looking at paper vouchers as a way to disperse the funds, as opposed to cards, which is what they ended up going with. And we had lots of conversations with them about perhaps what some of the limitations might be with that, where we talked about the flexibility of using particularly prepaid cards and electronic payment forms. And once they saw that, and they saw how it being used in other circumstances, they really saw the benefits of it. And actually, once the scheme went live, and they saw the data that was coming through, they saw that it was a relatively secure and safe way for consumers to pay. And there's also, there's wide acceptance, etc. it really made sense, and they've become real advocates for it since, and hence why other places like Northern Ireland and other places in the UK now are really looking at it very seriously.
Yeah, I guess just from my point of view, I would love to see them trial side by side a digital option beside a card option, so you still have the inclusivity, but that you maybe embrace the digital payments. Just in terms of when I look at the amount of sheer volume of cards, it's it's a lot of movement to deliver a scheme like the Jersey or the Northern Ireland scheme. And when you look at how quickly you could get funds into people's hands with the digital option, it seems like an opportunity to try it out.
I think you're right. I think, though, I suppose with all these things, it's a bit of a, and I hate to use the phrase because it's so often used these days, but it is a bit of a journey because, if you think about where we were with the public sector even, several years ago, I mean, you were, having discussions and having to almost convince them about, electronic payments and cards, at a very basic level, because there was a lot of anxiety about using them, a lot of nervousness and so forth. And now I think we've got to a stage where we've got a lot of government authorities and government departments comfortable with the idea of dispersing funds with cards, or in the case of commercial procurement card purchases, making payments using cards as a government. And I think the next phase will be, as you're sort of saying, getting them more comfortable with the idea of digital payments. And these things have a bit of there's a bit of a lag also, because you again, I go back to the point that one of the things that government, and this is the challenge, but also the opportunity, is governments are very, very keen to ensure that any solution that they have is as inclusive as possible. Now, the argument would be, well, you can have a wide variety of solutions, right? You can have a digital option, you can have a physical card option, etc. But they also like simple solutions too. And sometimes, just going down one route is easiest for them. I think over time that will for sure change, because as more and more people become kind of comfortable with smartphones. I mean, most people now have a smartphone. Many people are very comfortable using those phones for payments. It will happen, and I think your point around just the speed of being able to do something digital versus physical, obviously some of the cost implications of that too, I think is will resonate with government over time. But as I say, I think we're probably a little bit early in that phase of the discussion, simply because if you just generally sort of the speeds of conversations in government, it's not weeks or months, it's years sometimes, where you spend a lot of time with them, helping them to get comfortable with certain concepts and things, and then you start small, you grow, and then you get to the stage that you want to get to. So I'm very optimistic that we will get there with them, but as I say, it's a bit of a journey with them along the path, and I suspect for the next few years for sure. I think there'll be room for a mixed economy of different things, but the direction of travel is certainly towards electronic and digital payments and away from cash and vouchers and so forth, which it's taken a long time even to get to this point. So I think, as I say, it won't be long before digital payments and other forms, open banking and so forth, will also be part of that mix too.
I was at the European Payment Awards a couple of weeks ago and was actually delighted to see Revenue shortlisted for an award for Best Open Payment Initiative. So I think in terms of collecting council tax and things like that, using an open banking experience to allow people to push their council tax in. So it seems some parts of the public sector are probably moving forward in some of the innovation that's coming out in the payments. Have you seen that across Europe, or do you think UK is really the starting point for many of these initiatives?
No, I mean certainly in different parts of Europe. I mean, I'm less familiar with the other parts of Europe, but I know that open banking. I think in places like Poland, for example, it's actually relatively advanced, and also some of the Baltic areas as well, where open banking has become much more proliferate. We're seeing in some markets, not actually within Europe necessarily, but somewhere they're almost slightly leapfrogging cards to some extent to go straight to kind of more open banking type solutions, because in a sense, they sort of gone in that direction. I think in the UK, I think and Master, if I may say, Mastercard's general strategy around this is to support all types of payment flows. So you're probably aware that we own Vocalink, which operates the bank account rails, where things like BACS, faster payments, etc., all those different account-to-account payments flows. So we are extremely supportive of open banking, and we think there's I think with open banking, I think probably most people would probably agree that there's still a lot of its potential that's still to be harnessed to its fullest capability. But it's really great, as you say, to see the government is actually taking quite a leading step in this. HMRC, the Revenue and Customs, is one. We know that other government departments are starting to look at open banking. And then looking at it as much in the same way that we look at payments, which is just offering greater choice to the citizen, to the consumer. Mastercard's general, the sort of phrase that we use in our organization is we have a multi-rail strategy, which is whether a consumer wants to pay using the card rails or the bank account rails. We want to support those transactions, and we have technology and we have the capability to sort of do that. So from our perspective, and there are reasons why in some circumstances an organization may want to preference cards or may want to preference open banking or whatever it might be, and that's fine. From our perspective, we want to support all of those. But I think the UK, I don't think it's unfair to say, I think the UK is certainly one of the more kind of cutting edge markets, certainly from a government and public sector perspective when it comes to open banking. There's just a lot of companies here, fintechs, who have open banking propositions, who are playing in that space. And actually, I mean, we haven't talked about it yet. And I have to admit, I'm not a huge expert in this area. So, I'm hoping you're not going to have too many questions in the area. But, crypto is another area as well, where government is also now seriously looking at it. I mean, the Treasury here is starting to consult around the concept of a stable coin, for example. And, I think that also marks the sort of seriousness that UK PLC and the government takes in terms of looking at all the different types of new payment flows that are emerging in the market and wanting to sort of, have an opinion and also potentially facilitate some of those payments as well.
No, I mean, it's a very interesting space in terms of looking at a digital currency. And I think just as we were talking about moving from paper to cards to maybe digital payments, we're probably a few years off before you'll be receiving any grant payments in digital currency. I would imagine. Just I guess just taking another look in terms of the work the government does around distribution. We were saying that the card is quite a good fit because it's inclusive and it can be potentially limited in the spend so that the funds go to what they're intended. What do you see as the next requirement for the government in terms of disbursement? Is it around actually speeding up disbursement? Is it putting more control around it? What are their problem areas?
Yeah, so I think in the UK, certainly, I think the big kind of next opportunity in a sense with disbursements is actually around the welfare system as a whole. A lot of the current welfare system, so universal credit, for example, the way that people get access to common benefits, it's quite clunky, it's quite manual, and it requires the individual to do quite a lot of the legwork in terms of understanding what benefits that they are eligible for, and then being able to access those benefits and receive them. And most of those are also done via bank accounts, which obviously creates problems where if you don't have a bank account and you're not able to easily get one. Now, I should say under legislation in the UK, under the Payments Account Directives, which were EU regulations, but were enacted into the UK, everyone is legally entitled to a basic bank account. But we know that it can be difficult to open those up for a variety of reasons. So for me, the next area I think for the government to really look at is to sort of really transform that welfare disbursements piece, and that's with the Department for Work and Pensions. So that's one of the kind of last areas that hasn't really, in my view, sort of tapped into the capabilities and the opportunities that, particularly prepaid cards, but as you were talking about before about digital payments, they've not really been as forthcoming in terms of wanting to do stuff in that space, as, for example, some other areas of the government have been. For example, the Home Office, providing cards to asylum seekers, or whether it's the NHS who provides some prepaid cards for Healthy Start schemes, and so forth. So I think that's the area that still remains a bit untapped. And I think, the way some of the capabilities that you were mentioning in your question around the ability to have restrictions on where the card is used, being able to, at an anonymized level, obviously, but kind of monitor and see how people are transacting to really help improve the sort of way that the cards are operated and so forth. I think that for me remains a really big area that remains currently untapped. But encouragingly and interestingly, there is some movement now within that department because of the great work that's been done in Northern Ireland, because of some of the other government programs I've just mentioned, they are starting to see, prepaid cards as a way to disperse funds. Actually, they're really flexible. There's a really, great opportunity for us to do something here. So, but I go back to what I mentioned earlier on, the government moves, because it has to, it just moves at a slower speed than, say, a private sector organisation was in terms of being able to take a decision or direction on where they want to go. There's multiple stakeholders that have to be engaged. There's legislation that has to be referenced against, for example, the qualities of regulation. And there's also, just the sheer scale of these programs in government. You're talking about millions of people. So when you're trying to do something new in that space, there's a lot of steps you have to follow. There's a lot of process that has to be going through, a lot of governance, and obviously there's ministerial oversight on these programs too. So you have to be quite careful from a political point of view as to, how you position these sorts of things. And just as an aside, if I may, the post office here, for example, still disperses a lot of funds to particularly pensioners using old Giro cards. And the government has for a while been trying to get those customers to open up bank accounts to be able to disperse funds via the accounts. But there's still hundreds of thousands of customers who haven't opened up a bank account. And so as of next year, these post office cards will be closed. And the government has a big question mark as to what do they do with the customers who haven't, migrated onto the new solution. And again, that's all managed by the DWP. So again, I get, there is a really big opportunity in that whole welfare disbursements piece that I think we're starting to see the government shift some of its legacy opinions around their appetite for doing something in that space, which I think, provides, for me at least, encouragement that, as I say, it's all a journey, but, we will get there with them. But it will take a while to do that, simply because of the scale and complexity around the programs that they operate.
Well, thank you. It's been brilliant talking with you, Nabil. Very exciting space from a payments point of view to be focused on. I was delighted to hear that the governments are now starting to look at the data and the stories it's telling, because I really do think that helps feed back into making better decisions going forward as to where to spend public money or how to administrate it. So very exciting space to be in. Thank you for your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.